Imagine this. You walk up to your bank's ATM on an ordinary Tuesday. You insert your card, not expecting magic, just your own money, maybe a little less than you'd hoped. But today the machine offers you a secret. A glitch, not a dramatic crash. No sirens, just a quiet digital stumble. A stumble that lets you ask for money, any amount, and receive it. Money that isn't in your account. Money the bank hasn't approved. Money that by all rights should not exist for you. What would you do if you're honest with yourself? You know the answer. You'd report it. You'd call the number on the machine, heart pounding with civic duty, and say, there's something wrong with your ATM. But what if you weren't at your best? What if the person who found this crack in the system wasn't a criminal mastermind, wasn't a hacker in a dark room, but was just an ordinary man? A man who was drunk, broke, desperate, and deeply, humanly tempted. This is that story. The true story of how one man found a banking glitch, exploited it for months, lived as a millionaire, and was ultimately caught in a way that no one, especially not him, could have ever expected. I'm Joker, and tonight we're going behind the mask. The city was Wangaratta, Australia, 2011, where the biggest news was often the weekend football result. Dan Saunders was not from here. He'd followed his fiancée, Sarah, to this quiet corner of Victoria, trading the chaotic energy of Melbourne for a promise of stability. He loved her. That was the simple, anchoring truth in his life. Everything else was adrift. In Melbourne, he'd worked in a casino. It was a job that warped your perception of value. Money became chips, luck became a commodity, and the line between a good night and a disaster was as thin as a playing card. He'd met Sarah there. She was different, grounded, clear-eyed, untouched by the glitter and gloom of the tables. When she decided to return to her hometown, Wangaratta, Dan saw a chance at a different life. He followed. But a smaller city offered smaller opportunities. The rhythm he'd known vanished. He drifted through a series of low-wage, anonymous jobs. A cleaner in an office block after hours. Smelling of chemical lemons, a waiter in a family restaurant. His shirt perpetually stained with gravy. Each felt like a step down from the last. Finally, he landed a job as a bartender at a local pub. It was familiar territory, the smell of beer taps, the low hum of conversation, but it was a far cry from the casino floor. Here, the stakes were a spilled drink, a broken glass, a patron's sob story. The pay was a slow trickle that barely covered rent and his existing debts, which hung over him like a low ceiling. His relationship with Sarah began to strain under the weight of financial anxiety. Conversations about the future, a wedding, a house would falter and die, replaced by a tense silence. Dan felt he was shrinking in her eyes, becoming less of a partner and more of a problem to be managed. He sought solace in the very environment he worked in, the bar. After his shifts ended, he'd often stay drinking with the few friends he'd made, like his mate Mark. His relationship with Sarah began to strain under the weight of financial anxiety. Conversations about the future, a wedding, a house would falter and die, replaced by a tense silence. Dan felt he was shrinking in her eyes, becoming less of a partner and more of a problem to be managed. He sought solace in the very environment he worked in, the bar. After his shifts ended, he'd often stay drinking with the few friends he'd made, like his mate Mark. It was a cycle that fed on itself. Drink to forget the money problems, which created more money problems, which demanded another drink. The night it happened was a perfect storm of these conditions. Dan had closed the bar, cashed up the till, and headed out with Mark. They ended up at the bar of the Wangaratta Hotel, a tired, carpeted place with a neon sign that buzzed like an angry insect. They drank steadily, the talk moving from football to failed ambitions. Mark, sensible and due for an early shift, called it a night around 11:30 p.m. Dan should have left too, but a restless, defiant energy kept him glued to the stool. He wanted one more drink, a buffer between the camaraderie of the night and the silent, judging apartment he shared with Sarah. He reached for his wallet. It was empty. A cold clarity cut through the alcohol fog. He'd spent his last cash. Mark, his usual backstop, was gone. The barman was looking at him, waiting. A hot flush of shame spread up his neck. He mumbled an excuse and stumbled out into the night. The air was cool and damp, a light drizzle painting the streets in slick, reflective blacks. He needed money, just enough for a cab, or maybe just one more drink to settle his nerves. His brain, slowed by alcohol and anxiety, fixed on one solution, the ATM. He walked, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. After a few blocks, he saw the blue and gold logo of the National Australia Bank glowing in a recessed alcove, a sanctuary. He stepped into its faint electronic light. The time, displayed in crisp digital numbers on the screen, was 12:10 a.m. This detail would later become the cornerstone of his entire future. He fumbled for his wallet, pulling out his 2 cards. The first was for his savings account. He knew its state intimately, a barren digital field, a perfect round $0. The second was his credit card. Its limit was $2,000, a fragile lifeline he had been clinging to for months. He was living on its edge, a tightrope walk over a canyon of debt. With a sense of dread, he inserted the credit card and selected balance inquiry. The screen refreshed. Balance. $1,995. Credit available. $5. That was all that stood between him and the absolute, unyielding limit. A limit that meant no more groceries on credit, no more fuel, nothing. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. Then, a drunk, illogical idea surfaced. What if he could move money? The ATM menu offered transfers. In his addled state, it seemed to make a twisted sense move credit from one pocket of the bank to another. He selected transfer, chose credit card to savings account, and tapped in $200. He pressed confirm. The machine whirred for a second, but then a yellow error box flashed on the screen.
Transaction incorrect.
Transaction incorrect. A moment later, the machine emitted a sharp beep and ejected his card. There, that was that. The system had worked as it should. It had rejected an impossible request. Any rational person, any sober person, would have pocketed their cards and walked home, defeated. Dan was not that person tonight. A stubborn, frustrated curiosity took hold. What did incorrect mean? Did it mean the money hadn't moved? He had to see. He plucked his savings card from his wallet and inserted it. He selected balance inquiry. The screen did not show a 0. It did not show a negative. It displayed a message he had never seen in years of banking. Account balance cannot be displayed at this time. He stared. The bland, bureaucratic words seemed to hum with possibility. Cannot be displayed. Not is 0. Not is unavailable. Just unknown. A mystery. His finger, moving almost on its own, hovered over the cash withdrawal button. He pressed it. The machine asked for an amount, heart thudding in his ears, a sound louder than the drizzle outside. He typed 200. He pressed confirm. He expected another error. He expected the card to be spat back out. He did not expect the low mechanical rumble from deep within the machine. He did not expect the slot to open and for 20 crisp $10 notes to slide out. The machine beeped politely.
Please take your cash.
Please take your cash. He stood frozen, the money in his hand. It was real. The paper felt cool and substantial. He looked from the cash to the screen, which now prompted him to take his card. The $200 in his hand had no origin. It was not from his empty savings. It was not from his maxed-out credit card. It was a phantom, a gift from a broken machine. For a second, a lifetime of conditioning screamed at him. This is wrong. Put it back. Report it. A louder, more immediate voice, fueled by desperation and alcohol, replied, "This is for the drinks you couldn't buy. For the shame at the bar, for the look in Sarah's eyes." He took the money. He took his card. And he walked, not home, back to the hotel bar. He paid for his drink. And the next, the phantom cash feeling both weightless and heavy in his pocket. The moral calculus was postponed. For now, there was only the warm, numbing relief. Dan left the bar around 12:50 a.m. The drizzle had become a proper rain, a cold, insistent downpour. He hurried along, head down, until he found himself once again taking shelter under the familiar awning of the NAB ATM. It was the same machine. It hummed innocently, a blue sentinel in the night. Sheltered from the rain, the alcohol in his system now mixing with a jittery electric alertness, he stared at the keypad. The event replayed in his mind, the failed transfer, the mysterious message, the impossible cash. Was it a one-time fluke? The question was a dare. He had to know. With the methodical focus of the profoundly inebriated, he recreated his steps. Step 1. Insert savings card. Result. Account balance cannot be displayed at this time. Same message. Step 2. Eject. Insert credit card. Attempt $200 transfer. Result. Transaction. Incorrect. Card ejected. Step 3. Eject. Reinsert savings card. Do not check balance. Go directly to withdraw. He typed 200. Confirmed. The familiar, beautiful rumble. The slot opened. Another $200 emerged. His breath caught. It wasn't a fluke. It was a process, a sequence that tricked the machine into opening its vault. Emboldened, he tried again. This time, he asked for $400. The process was identical. Savings card, mystery message, credit card, failed transfer, savings card withdrawal. The machine dispensed $400 without complaint. He did it again. $100. Whiter, clunk, cash. He was a conductor, and the ATM was an orchestra playing a forbidden symphony. By the time he was done, his wallet was fat with over $2,000 in assorted notes. The rain had eased. He walked home, his pockets heavy, his mind racing, and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. The hangover the next morning was brutal, but the memory was sharp and clear. It felt like a dream, a fantastical stress dream about money. Then he opened his wallet on the bedside table. The pile of cash was still there, a chaotic, undeniable fact. A cold fear replaced the hangover nausea. What have I done? He immediately logged into his online banking. This was 2011, so it was a slow desktop affair. He refreshed the page, waiting for the digital axe to fall. His savings account, $0. His credit card, minus $1,995. Nothing. No change. No record of withdrawals. No record of transfers. It was as if the ATM and the bank's main brain were not speaking to each other. The $2,000 existed in his wallet, but not in their ledger. It was ghost money. He spent the day in a state of high paranoia, jumping at the phone, expecting a call from the bank security department, or worse, the police. The call never came. The silence was more unnerving than any accusation. The following morning, over 24 hours since his midnight adventure, he called the bank's automated phone line, punching in his details for a balance check. The robotic voice delivered the verdict. Your savings account balance is minus $2,000. Your credit card balance is minus $1,995. There it was, the correction. The system had finally woken up, noticed the discrepancy, and reversed the phantom withdrawal. It had simply converted it into a debt. The $2,000 he held was now a $2,000 loan he hadn't applied for. But Dan, his mind now clear and analytical, saw past the debt to the mechanics. He requested a mailed statement. When it arrived, it was revealing. The minus $2,000 appeared as a simple adjustment or ATM withdrawal on his savings. There was no correlating entry on his credit card, no record of the failed transfer attempt he'd made. It was as if the money had spontaneously generated in his savings account for a few hours, and the bank had simply corrected a random error. This was the crack. The system had two parts: the ATM, the terminal, and the main banking server, the brain. They didn't sync in real time, especially in the dead of night. His failed transfer attempt at 12:10 a.m. had somehow created a temporary ghost credit in his savings account at the ATM level. The ATM, operating on slightly stale or partitioned data, honored it. The main server knew nothing until its next update cycle over 24 hours later. By then, the cash was gone, and all it could do was mark the debt. Dan was not a programmer, but he understood machines, processes, and loopholes. He'd seen similar lags in casino payout systems. He formulated a theory, the midnight window. Sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., during a maintenance or backup cycle, the ATM's connection to the main server was weakened. It could perform transactions locally, but the authorization checks were flawed. A rejected transfer could leave a temporary shadow in the system, a shadow you could withdraw. The implications were staggering. If the correction took over 24 hours and the process was repeatable, he could stay ahead of the debt. A few nights later, sober and trembling with purpose, he went back to test his theory. It was 12:15 a.m. First, he checked his savings minus $2,000. The debt was real. He checked his credit card, minus $1,995. He attempted a $1,000 transfer from credit to savings, rejected. He checked his savings again. The balance now read, minus $1,000. His heart skipped a beat. The system had accepted half of the rejected transfer. It was applying the credit even as it declared the transaction invalid. He tried another $1,000 transfer. Rejected. Checked savings, $0. He had erased his debt. Not really, of course. The server would correct it tomorrow. But in this moment, at this ATM, his slate was clean. The final test. He attempted a $2,000 transfer. Rejected. Checked savings, $2,000. He withdrew the $2,000. The machine gave it to him. His savings account at the ATM read $0. He walked away, $2,000 richer, his mind soaring. He had not just found a glitch, he had reverse-engineered a financial illusion. The rule was simple but ironclad. You must perform the ritual every night. The nightly transfer had to cover the previous night's withdrawal debt before the server could post it permanently. If you withdrew $10,000 on Monday night, you had to transfer at least $10,000 on Tuesday night to zero it out plus whatever new cash you wanted. The numbers would have to escalate, a pyramid scheme built on a time delay. It was terrifying. One missed night, and the entire fictional edifice would collapse into a very real six-figure debt that would trigger every alarm at the bank. But if he kept the rhythm, he had a money tree, and it bloomed only after midnight. The first withdrawals felt like winning a small daily lottery. He paid off his nagging debts. He bought rounds for the whole bar, bathing in the temporary warmth of being the good bloke. When friends asked, he spun a tale of a hot streak on the horse races. It was plausible. He was known to bet. The lie was easy. But the secret was a corrosive acid. He couldn't tell Sarah. Her morality was a straight line, forged in her faith and her work as a teacher. He saw the glitch as a victimless crime against a faceless corporation. He knew she would see it as simple theft, a fundamental betrayal. So he hid it, and the hiding created a gulf between them that his new cash could not bridge. He also discovered the glitch wasn't tied to that one ATM. Any national Australia bank machine would do. The system itself was flawed. This realization changed everything. It wasn't a lucky machine. It was a broken protocol. He wasn't exploiting a local error, but a systemic one. His spending escalated with his confidence. He moved from withdrawing hundreds to thousands per night. The logic of the glitch demanded it. To keep the fictional balance at zero, the numbers had to grow. $5,000 one night required a transfer of over $5,000. The next just to stay even. It was a sprint on a treadmill that kept speeding up. It also led to his first major crisis. His gambling, always a problem, exploded with the influx of free money. He would bet thousands on a single horse race through the Taybee terminal at his bar. The losses were staggering, but meaningless because the cash was endless. It became a game of chasing losses with larger, more absurd bets. The manager of the bar, a pragmatic man, eventually got a call from TAB headquarters. One of his employees was placing bets larger than the bar's total monthly turnover. They suspected fraud, that Dan was taking betting slips without putting cash in the till. The manager audited the register. The money was always there. Puzzled and deeply suspicious, he confronted Dan, who could only repeat his horse racing lie. It wasn't believable. In a small town, whispers turn into shouts. Dan was fired. The loss of his job was irrelevant financially, but it was a social earthquake. The news traveled fast to Sarah. The final thread of his respectable, struggling life snapped. She didn't ask for explanations. She sent a text message that felt like a door slamming shut. I don't know what you're doing with your life, but I don't want to have any relationship in it. Consider what's between us. Over. Devastated, and now truly untethered. Dan did the only thing he could think of. He called Mark, his oldest friend, standing on a street corner, the weight of his secret crushing him. He confessed everything: the glitch, the process, the money. Mark listened in stunned silence. "You're joking," he said, not as a question, but a plea. When Dan convinced him it was real, Mark sighed. "Look, mate, that's on you. I don't want any part of it. But you're still my friend." With Wangaratta now a museum of his failures, Dan proposed an escape. "Let's get out of here. Melbourne, my treat." Mark, seeing his friend's desperation, agreed. They arrived in Melbourne like kings, checking into a foreign land. Dan booked them into the Crown Towers, a palace of glass and marble overlooking the Yarra River. That first night, standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, the city glittering like a spilled jewel box below him, Dan felt a profound shift. This wasn't just paying off debt or buying drinks. This was transformation. The money could erase his old life and build a new, dazzling one in its place. But even here, the ritual persisted. Every night, between midnight and 1, he would slip away from the casino floor or the penthouse bar, find an NAB ATM in the hotel lobby or a nearby street, and perform the sacred sequence. It was his anchor, his tether to the source of the dream. He entrusted Mark with the cards once, when a trip to a private island required an overnight stay. Calling him nervously to confirm the transfer was done, the system demanded absolute fidelity. In Melbourne, the dam broke completely. He invited other friends up from Wangaratta. He became the architect of a perpetual rotating party. They lived in a bubble of pure consumption. They traveled only by limousine or for trips across the city by chartered helicopter. The limo drivers received $500 tips for 10-minute rides. They didn't book rooms. They booked entire penthouses or floors of five-star hotels for week-long parties, where strangers became best friends for a night, fueled by top-shelf liquor. Dan's spending became performance art. He would walk into a restaurant and pay the tab for every table. He heard an elderly couple in a cafe lamenting they couldn't afford Hawaii. He approached them and handed over $40,000 in cash from his backpack. He found homeless individuals and booked them into suites at the Hilton for a week. When hotel management called to report missing towels and coffee machines from those rooms, Dan just laughed and paid for them. He paid off his friends' student loans, card debts, and mortgages. Money ceased to have meaning. It was a social lubricant, a tool for admiration, a drug that made everyone around him feel invincible. For 4 months, this was his life, a hurricane of cash, swirling around a calm, terrified eye, because at the core, Dan was waiting for the end. He slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of prison bars that looked like ATM slots. He drank more to quiet the fear which only amplified his paranoia. He was living a fantasy, but he was a prisoner to the nightly ritual and the gnawing certainty that it would all come crashing down. The psychological toll became unsustainable. The guilt he had suppressed began to surface, not about the bank, but about the person he had become, a caricature of wealth, lying to everyone he cared about. He gathered his friends in a hotel suite littered with empty bottles.
I'm done. I can't live like this anymore. The pressure, it's gonna kill me before the police do.
"I'm done," he said, his voice hollow. "I can't live like this anymore. The pressure, it's going to kill me before the police do." There was disappointment, but also understanding. He performed one final massive transfer. He told his friends to take what they wanted from the resulting cash, a final severance package from the dream. They left, returning to their normal lives in Wangaratta, forever changed. Dan was left alone in a quiet hotel room with a bathtub full of roughly $80,000 in leftover cash. For the first time in over 120 nights, he did not go to an ATM. He sat on the bed and waited for the knock on the door, for the world to right itself. The knock never came. The silence was deafening. A day passed, then a week, then a month. He moved back to Wangaratta, the cash slowly dwindling from daily living. The bank's main server had, of course, corrected the final massive discrepancy. On paper, Dan Saunders owed the National Australia Bank well over $1.6 million. And yet, nothing happened. Occasionally, the bank would call. A man who called himself Barney from the Financial Review office would tersely inform him, "You're a bad boy, Dan. A very bad boy. You will go to prison for this." But no police arrived. No summons was issued. The threats were sound and fury, signifying a bank trapped in a nightmare of its own making. Dan finally understood their paralysis. To prosecute him, the bank would have to stand in a courtroom and state, Our security was so catastrophically flawed that a bartender, using only 2 standard debit cards, was able to trick our ATMs into giving him $1.6 million over 4 months, and we didn't notice. The reputational damage, the loss of customer trust, the shareholder panic, it would cost them orders of magnitude more than the stolen sum. It was cheaper, safer to let him go and quietly patch the hole, hoping he would just disappear. But Dan couldn't disappear. He lived in a state of purgatory, not caught, not free. The anxiety of waiting for an arrest that never came was, in a way, worse than prison. It was a psychological torture. After 2 years of this limbo, he snapped. He needed resolution, even if it meant forcing the handcuffs on himself. He decided to go public. If the bank wouldn't act, he would make the story so big they'd be forced to. His first stop was a major metropolitan newspaper. A journalist was enthralled. They flew Dan to Sydney, put him in a suit, and photographed him looking pensively out of a private plane's window. The article was sensational, but ultimately a one-day wonder. The bank issued a terse no comment, and the world moved on. Frustrated, Dan aimed higher. He contacted a current affair, Australia's most watched and most aggressive current affairs TV program. To the producers, Dan was a gold mine, a charming confessional everyman who had outsmarted a giant bank. They offered him the full treatment, a week of filming, recreations of his extravagant life, dramatic interviews. Dan, desperate for a conclusion, agreed to everything.
Dan was a gold mine, a charming, confessional everyman who had outsmarted a giant bank.
For 7 days, he was back in the fantasy. They filmed him in limos in luxury hotel suites, narrating his descent into madness. He felt a bizarre sense of catharsis, finally telling his story to an audience of millions. He believed this exposure would be the trigger. The bank would have to respond. The night the episode aired, Dan watched from a friend's couch. There he was, his life edited into a thrilling hour-long caper. He watched, heart pounding, waiting for the postscript about police charges. It came at the very end. The presenter, her face grave, addressed the camera. And tonight, Dan Saunders is a wanted man. Police have issued a warrant for his arrest. If you have any information on his whereabouts, please contact Crime Stoppers. Dan froze. A ye wanted man? The producers knew exactly where he was. They had his phone number. They had just spent a week with him. This was a manufactured cliffhanger for ratings. The betrayal was stomach-churning. Later that night, he received a chirpy email from one of the show's producers. Great to work with you, Dan. If you'd like to come by the studio this Thursday to collect your photos and release forms, you're welcome to. It was so obviously a trap, but Dan was done running. He was done with the fear, the waiting, the manipulation. If this was how it ended, with a televised arrest, so be it. On Thursday, he walked into the studio's reception. The moment he gave his name, a signal was given. A swarm of photographers erupted from doorways, cameras flashing. TV cameras owned by the very show he had participated in rolled. From behind a potted plant, a police officer stepped forward, not with a tactical team, but almost like an actor hitting his mark.
Dan Saunders, you're under arrest.
Dan Saunders, you're under arrest. The scene was perfect. The heroic journalists, the dramatic capture. It was all for the cameras. The reality, learned from a weary legal aid lawyer in a stark police interview room, was even more absurd than the glitch itself. The arresting officer was not part of any financial crimes unit. He was a friend of the TV producer, called in as a favor to create good television. There was no active warrant. The bank had still not officially reported the crime. The police were acting solely on the confession broadcast on national television. The bank, true to form, remained in the shadows. refusing to cooperate or provide evidence. The trial was a farce built on a void. The prosecution, led by the state because the bank refused to be the complainant, struggled to explain the mechanics of the crime without the bank's technical testimony. How do you prosecute a man for stealing digital phantom money from a system the victim won't admit was broken? The judge was perplexed. The bank's absence spoke louder than any evidence. They were clearly terrified of the spotlight. In the end, with no victim willing to step forward and detail their losses, the court's hands were tied. Dan pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of obtaining financial advantage by deception. The sentence was a reflection of the case's bizarre nature: 1 year in prison. He served his time in a low-security facility. For Dan, it was almost a relief, a definitive end to the uncertainty. The sentence was not for stealing $1.6 million, but for embarrassing an institution so powerfully that it refused to acknowledge the theft. He was released after 12 months. The debt of $1.6 million was theoretically still owed, but the bank never pursued it. To do so would resurrect the story. Today, Dan Saunders is a free man. He gives interviews on podcasts and YouTube channels. He is writing a book. A film adaptation is in development. He has become a folk hero to some, a cautionary tale to others. In every interview, he is asked the same final question: did you manage to save any of the money? Is there a secret account somewhere? Dan always offers the same faint smile. No comment. The glitch is closed. The machine is fixed. But the question he first asked in the rain remains, hanging in the air for anyone to answer. You walk up to a bank ATM and discover a glitch. What would you do?